All right, this is Openstax U.S. History, Chapter 29, Section 2, Lyndon Johnson and the Great Society. So following President Kennedy's assassination, we talked about that in 29.1, the presidency of Kennedy and what he did. After he was assassinated, his vice president, Lyndon Johnson, became president. Great Society, or the Great Society, is the name for Johnson's domestic program. And Johnson had a lot that he wanted to accomplish. There's a lot of details in the text about the specific laws and policies that President Johnson passed. You can see President Johnson right here. I think that looks like Johnson right there. But for the most part, what the Great Society included was domestic programs designed to help Americans in a variety of different ways, which included education reforms, things like making funds available to go to college. It also included things like consumer protection laws, protection against the environment. It created public broadcasting in the form of PBS and NPR, NPR being a National Public Radio, PBS, Public Broadcasting System for television. One of Johnson's laws also in this Great Society program included the Immigration and Nationality Act, which pretty much reverted the restrictive immigration laws of the 1920s. In other words, this Immigration and Nationality Act, you might say, opened up immigration more. And this was, in the 1920s, you had some very restrictive immigration measures passed. This sort of reform that allowed immigration to not be based so much off national origin, which is what the laws of the 1920s were passed on, instead more like a merit-based system for immigration. Collectively, Johnson called his Great Society programs a war on poverty. So this was maybe the slogan for the Great Society. And that's really what all these programs have in common. It's this effort to help alleviate poverty. Here's a picture of Lyndon Johnson meeting with some people in Appalachia, which was one of the poorest parts of the nation. Appalachia is in the Appalachian Mountains, kind of on the east coast of the United States. The Economic Opportunity Act was also part of this program, or the EOA provided housing subsidies, that is, helped to assist with certain housing. It created various economic opportunities, job training programs, and probably most importantly about Johnson's Great Society was the medical programs. Medicare provided medical care for the elderly, right, 65 plus. Medicaid did the same thing, provided medical care for those in poverty. So if you met a certain wealth threshold, you could get medical care through both those programs. Medicaid and Medicare very much still with us today. So all these things collectively, education, consumer protection, housing programs, job training programs, Medicare, Medicaid, all these things fall under Johnson's Great Society program. Now, Johnson himself as president, there's three things really to know about his presidency. The Great Society is one. The position on civil rights is the other, because President Johnson essentially is the president to sign off on major civil rights legislation that eventually kind of ends the era of Jim Crow, ends the era of segregation in the South, and that is the form of the Civil Rights Act in 1964. Now, initially, President Kennedy had pushed for this, urging Congress to pass civil rights legislation. He, of course, was assassinated. The question was, would Johnson continue Kennedy's legacy? Johnson himself was a Democrat from Texas, a segregated state, and so there was maybe some belief that perhaps Johnson would not follow through with Kennedy's civil rights legislation, but he actually does. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 is, in some cases, you might call it the kind of the apex of the civil rights movement. This prohibits segregation in public accommodations and employment. among other institutions. So that system of, different lunch counters, white and black, separate drinking fountains, white and black, the Civil Rights Act prohibits that, makes that illegal across the entire nation. It also establishes the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission that is to investigate racial discrimination in the workplace. If you feel like you have not been given a fair, fair interview or a fair firing, job performance, whatever it is, you can bring it in front of the EEOC and they'll investigate it. So this is kind of a what you might call an enforcement of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The 24th Amendment. So the Civil Rights Act, tackled the issue of public accommodations. It tackled the issue of employment, but there was still one big glaring issue out there, and that was the issue of voting. And if we recall back all the way back to the chapter on Reconstruction, the 15th Amendment to the Constitution prohibited voting based off of, it prohibited banning people from voting based off race, color, or previous servitude. But Southern states were able to kind of work around the 15th Amendment by instituting various number of things like poll taxes, literacy tests, and other laws that disenfranchised African Americans. And so this question of voting was still not yet addressed. And so the 24th Amendment, which was passed by Congress, banned poll taxes. Bloody Sunday, MLK, Martin Luther King Jr. marched from Selma. This was a national march in order to address the issue of voting. There was violence during this march. It was nicknamed Bloody Sunday, so this is violence. And a new political faction, you might say, emerged, because recall the Democratic Party for a long time, really ever since the Civil War and Abraham Lincoln, had been the party of the Solid South, had been the party of the segregated South. Well, Johnson, Kennedy to a certain extent, but Johnson being the president to sign off on civil rights legislation, a lot of those Southern Democrats are moving away from the Democratic Party and looking for other candidates. George Wallace becomes the segregation candidate. However you spell candidate. His saying or his slogan, George Wallace, segregation today, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. So a lot of those previous Democrats are breaking away from the party because of Johnson's civil rights legislation. And lastly, the law that addresses the issue of voting is the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which bans a lot of these things like, literacy tests, etc., right? Various laws that were used to disenfranchise African Americans in the South, despite the fact that you had the 15th Amendment. So when we look at the entire civil rights movement as a whole and what the movement was seeking to accomplish, and ending of segregation in institutions, and the extension of voting rights, those things more or less are accomplished by 1964 and 1965. And historically speaking, we would say that by 1964 and 1965, the civil rights movement kind of comes to an end, and instead you have kind of further reforms that go on. So for example, Martin Luther King Jr., after 1965, he focused on poverty and became an advocate for trying to eliminate poverty in the United States, and other members of the civil rights movement went on to different and other causes. So Johnson is the president to, again, sign off on civil rights legislation that more or less accomplishes what the goal of the civil rights movement was, and that was to end segregation in the South. The last thing to know about Johnson is his role in Vietnam. Johnson is the president most responsible for U.S. involvement in Vietnam. Recall last chapter, President Kennedy was sending support to South Vietnam, which for the most part was under the U.S. military. The ruler of South Vietnam, Ngo Dinh Diem, had been assassinated in 1963, and they were fighting against what was called the NLF, the National Liberation Front, which sought to create a united Vietnam, also sought to create a communist Vietnam because of receiving support from the Soviet Union and China at the time. President Johnson wanted to increase American commitment there. At the time, there's only 16,000 troops in Vietnam. Johnson wanted to increase that so the South could better fight against the NLF and Ho Chi Minh in the North. And he got that in a controversial event known as the Gulf of Tonkin. So the Gulf of Tonkin itself is a body of water. It is, if you look at this map right here, this is roughly where the Gulf of Tonkin was. And the Gulf of Tonkin, there was an incident in which a U.S. ship, the USS Maddox, we got a little ship here, it didn't have, probably shouldn't have drawn a steamship, it wasn't a steamship, but anyways, it was reported that in the Gulf of Tonkin that a U.S. ship, the USS Maddox, was fired upon by the North Vietnamese more than once. President Johnson and his administration used this attack, or at least reported attack, to go to Congress and ask for the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. This would allow Johnson to increase U.S. involvement in Vietnam. And Congress, under the impression that the North Vietnamese had fired upon American ships, passed the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which essentially allowed for President Johnson to increase American involvement pretty much as he wanted. The Gulf of Tonkin resolution said President Johnson can take all necessary measures. And so in 1963, American troops numbered 16,000 when President Kennedy was killed. By the time you get to 1968, the United States has roughly 500,000 troops in Vietnam. So significant escalation occurring under President Johnson. The U.S. General William Westmoreland, this U.S., I don't know if his exact title was general, but we'll just call him general, continued to increase escalation year after year until you got to this roughly 500,000 part in 1968. It was very difficult for the United States to tell whether or not it was winning the war in Vietnam. The goal was to contain communism. Here you see the 17th parallel that divides the South. So this was controlled by the U.S. This was controlled, by Ho Chi Minh and the North Vietnamese. But this conflict was a conflict that was much more of a urban versus rural. Many of the cities were controlled by the U.S. A lot of the countryside was sided with the NLF, the Viet Cong, and Ho Chi Minh. And during the conflict, it was difficult to tell whether or not the U.S. was winning. The measure stick or the yardstick of success, for the most part, was body count or kill count. And on any given day, the United States was winning that metric. The metric the U.S. was losing in Vietnam, though, was the hearts and minds. And as more U.S. occupation occurred and the longer that soldiers stayed there, more and more the Vietnamese population came to resent the U.S. presence there. And so even though the kill count was in the favor of the U.S., the hearts and minds, that side of the equation the U.S. was losing. And so during these years from 1963 to 1968, the United States was, it was being reported that the U.S. was winning, and it was on the verge of saving South Vietnam from the communists, any day now. And that, again, dragged on for 5 years or so. The Tet Offensive was a massive attack on the U.S., including the U.S. capital in Vietnam, which was Saigon. We'll just call it U.S. capital. It was where the embassy was at. And this was finally the tipping point in which most Americans came to realize after the Tet Offensive that Vietnam can't be won. That if the U.S. was, winning for 5 years, if it had 500,000 soldiers there, well, at this point, it's kind of time to pack your bags and leave. And that's when a lot of the public opinion started to turn against Johnson, so much so that in 1968, when Johnson was up for re-election, his stance in Vietnam, which he was firmly committed to it, had essentially ended his political career. And in 1968, Johnson refused to run for re-election. And this created a lot of political instability. It had been a very long time since a president did not seek re-election, and it was his commitment to Vietnam and the fact that by 1968 Vietnam was so unpopular that he more or less decided to step back. Vietnam helped create a certain sense of instability back at home. riots erupted, both race in the aftermath of the civil rights movement and anti-war riots in major American cities. The U.S. draft, again, the draft, mandatory military service, went into effect, and you had people who sought to, refuse the draft and protest it and stand up in opposition to it. There were a lot more draft deferments. A draft deferment excuses one from the draft. And, disproportionately, it was those who were, experiencing poverty. It was those who were minorities, like blacks and Latinos, who were not able to get these deferments. And so generally when we talk about the Vietnam War, we talk about the war as being a poor man's fight, so to speak. And this was unlike World War II, for example, which was a war which united the country much more so than this conflict in Vietnam. Additionally, the war cost a lot of money, right? And especially during the 1960s. On the one hand, you have the Great Society, which is all these programs to help education and stuff like that at home. That was very expensive. And then you have the war at home, right? A war on poverty and a war against communism. And, as the saying goes, you can only spend $1 once. And so the national debt of the United States increased dramatically during Johnson's administration and even afterwards.